In a small village called Nyamira, there lived a little girl named Achieng. She was always sick and coughed all the time. Her stepfather often looked at her with cold eyes and said, "She's too weak to survive anyway." While other children stood in line to get vaccines, Achieng was left outside, sitting on a wooden bench, watching through the window. Her heart ached, not just from illness, but from feeling unwanted. Her mother, quiet and gentle, leaned down one day and whispered, "Be strong, my child. One day, they will come to you for health." That night, Achieng burned with fever. Her small body shook under a thin blanket, but her eyes stayed open. She did not dream of toys or sweets like other children. She dreamed of needles, medicine, and healing people. In her mind, she saw herself in a white coat, helping children like her. Even though her body was weak, her spirit was strong. No one believed in her, but she had already decided she would grow up and learn about health, about vaccines, and one day she would return not as the sick girl they ignored, but as someone who could save lives. When Achieng turned 10, something terrible happened. A strong fever hit her body, and for days she was too weak to get out of bed. Her skin burned, her eyes watered, and her whole body felt like fire. She had caught measles, a sickness that could have been prevented with a simple vaccine. But her family never believed in vaccines. They said, God will protect her. They refused to buy the shot that could have saved her from this pain. Achieng cried through the nights, unable to sleep. Her mother tried to comfort her with cold cloths and whispered prayers, but nothing seemed to work. After many hard days, Achieng finally survived. The fever broke, the rash faded, her body slowly healed, but something inside her had changed forever. She could no longer hear clearly in one ear. From that day, the kids in her village gave her a name, the Silent Girl. Some used it to tease her. Others just said it because she had stopped talking much. But Achieng didn't mind. In fact, she liked silence. She had learned that quiet could be powerful. While other kids laughed and played, Achieng listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole heart. Her family was still poor, and with no money for school, Achieng had to find ways to survive. She started working in a nearby hospital, not as a nurse or a student, but as a cleaner. She washed floors, scrubbed toilets, and carried water buckets. Anything to earn a small meal. But while she cleaned, she paid attention. She watched the nurses as they moved from bed to bed. She saw how doctors talked about viruses, immunity, and vaccines. She didn't understand all the words, but she remembered them. She swept the hallways slowly, so she could stay near the doors of the medical rooms, where she could hear bits of lessons and patient stories. Sometimes she found small pieces of paper thrown away by the staff, old notes, medical forms, or lecture handouts. She would take them home and read them under a candlelight, even if she didn't know what all the words meant. She asked questions to anyone who would answer, even the guards, the cooks, the lab assistants. Many ignored her, but some smiled and gave her simple answers. Achieng soaked up everything like a sponge. She didn't have books. She didn't have internet. She didn't even have her hearing in one ear. But she had something stronger than all of that. She had a hunger to learn. Her heart burned with questions. Why did she get so sick? Why did she lose her hearing? What was in those tiny bottles called vaccines that could stop children from suffering like she had? One day, while cleaning the hospital hallway, she heard a doctor talking to a medical student about antibodies. She wrote the word down with a broken pencil on the edge of a newspaper. Later, she asked a nurse what it meant. The nurse smiled and said, "It's what protects your body from disease." Achieng's eyes lit up. She wanted to learn more. She wanted to understand how the body worked, how vaccines were made, and how they saved lives. People around her started to notice. Though she was still the silent girl, her eyes were always full of thought, always watching, always learning. Some doctors began to talk to her, surprised by her interest. One even gave her an old science textbook. It was full of big words, but Achieng read it page by page. She underlined words, drew small diagrams, and wrote questions in the margins. Every word brought her closer to her dream. Achieng may not have had a voice that people listened to. She may not have had a teacher or a school, or even enough food most days, but she had something no one could take from her. a burning desire to understand the very thing that almost killed her. Her silence was no longer a weakness, it was her secret strength. While others spoke, she listened. While others ignored, she noticed. And every day, as she swept the hospital floors, she was quietly building the foundation of a future no one saw coming, not even her. By the time Achieng turned 17, her hunger to learn had grown stronger than ever. She still worked cleaning hospital floors, but every day she watched students in white coats walk past her with books in their hands and confidence in their eyes. They were studying medicine at Bogoma Nursing College nearby. Achieng wanted to be one of them, not just dreaming about health and vaccines, but truly learning how they worked. But she had no money, no school papers, and no one to recommend her. Still, she refused to let that stop her. One day, she got an idea that would change her life. She found an old janitor's uniform and quietly copied a staff ID card she had seen. It wasn't perfect, but it looked close enough. She tucked it into her shirt and walked into the college building like she belonged there. Her heart beat fast, her hands trembled, but she kept her head low and walked with purpose. No one stopped her. That day, Achieng sat at the back of a medical lecture for the first time in her life. She hid behind a pillar, far from the front, and scribbled notes with a half-broken pencil she had borrowed from a hospital clerk. She didn't understand everything the lecturer was saying, but her ears caught words she remembered: immunity, virus, antibodies, prevention. Her brain worked hard, connecting the dots from all she had picked up over the years. Each time she finished her cleaning job early, she returned. Day after day, she came back to sit in those classes in secret, always careful not to be seen too much, always writing as fast as she could. One afternoon, as she was copying diagrams from a whiteboard, a soft voice behind her said, "You're not on the list of students." Achieng froze. She turned slowly and looked up into the eyes of a woman, kind eyes, but sharp. It was a lecturer, and Achieng was sure she would be thrown out, maybe even arrested. But instead, the woman leaned closer and whispered, "If you want to learn, I will teach you." That woman was Dr. Tumwine, one of the senior lecturers at the college. She had noticed Achieng sitting quietly at the back of several lectures. She had watched how focused she was, how curious, and instead of punishing her, she saw something rare, a student who wanted to learn more than anything else in the world. From that day, Achieng had a secret mentor. Dr. Tumwine gave her old textbooks, guided her through complicated topics, and even allowed her to sit in official classes sometimes when no one was watching. Achieng studied at night by candlelight, using pages filled with medical notes and flashcards she made by hand. She practiced speaking medical terms quietly to herself, even though one ear still didn't work well. Dr. Tumwine became like the teacher Achieng had never had, patient, kind, but strict. She pushed Achieng to not only memorize facts, but to understand why vaccines mattered, how viruses spread, and what it truly meant to protect a life. Achieng learned about the measles virus, the same one that almost took her life. She learned how a small vaccine could stop so much pain. Every fact she learned made her more determined. One day, after months of secret studying, Dr. Tumwine sat Achieng down. "You're ready for something bigger," she said. "There's a scholarship program in Accra, in Ghana. They teach immunology there, the science of vaccines, and the body's defense." Achieng's eyes widened. Accra felt like a different world. She had never even left her village alone, but she trusted her mentor. With Dr. Tumwine's help, Achieng filled out forms she had never seen before. She wrote an essay about her journey, about the sickness, the silence, the cleaning jobs, the listening, the dreams. When she sent the application, her hands shook. She didn't believe anyone would choose a poor girl with no formal education and no real background. But a few months later, a letter arrived with her name on it. She opened it slowly, and tears filled her eyes. She had been accepted, full scholarship. Achieng stood outside the hospital that day, looking up at the sky. She thought of the time she had sat outside clinics as a child, coughing and waiting, while other kids got vaccinated. She remembered her mother's whisper, "One day, they'll beg you for health." That day had come closer. She packed her small bag, hugged Dr. Tumwine tightly, and left for Accra. The girl who once swept hospital floors was now stepping into a world of science and learning, not because she had all the tools, but because she never stopped dreaming. Her journey was still a secret to most, but she was no longer just a silent girl hiding in the shadows. She was becoming something powerful, a voice for those who had none. Many years had passed since Achieng left her village, Nyamira. The girl they once called weak, silent, and useless had grown into something no one expected, a vaccine researcher with a degree, knowledge, and a heart full of purpose. She had studied hard in Accra, stayed up late learning every single thing about how vaccines work, how diseases spread, and how to stop children from suffering the way she once did. She had seen what science could do, and now she was coming back, not for revenge, not to prove anything, but to help. When Achieng stepped off the bus in Nyamira, she was not the same girl who had once sat outside the clinic, coughing and forgotten. She wore a clean white coat and carried coolers filled with life-saving vaccines, funded by a global health organization. Her name tag read Dr. Achieng, and her eyes were full of quiet strength. She had travelled from village to village, working long hours, meeting children, comforting mothers, and spreading protection through tiny syringes. But this visit meant more than any other. This was her home. The people of Nyamira were no longer proud and stubborn. A terrible measles outbreak had hit the village. Children were sick. Some had already died. The same families who once told Achieng's mother, "God will protect us," now stood in long lines, holding their babies and begging for help. Mothers cried as they waited. Fathers looked away, ashamed. Even the elders, who once dismissed science, now whispered prayers for someone, anyone, to come save their children. And then they saw her. At first, some didn't recognize her. She had grown, her back straight, her shoulders strong. But when she spoke, the village went quiet. "No child will be left behind," she said, her voice calm but powerful. "Not on my watch." She opened the cooler and took out the vaccines. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused. She vaccinated child after child with the same gentle care she had once dreamed about when she lay sick and shivering under a thin blanket. Parents thanked her, some with tears in their eyes. Others couldn't even speak. They just nodded and held her hand. For Achieng, this wasn't just a job. This was her mission. One mother stepped forward with a baby tied to her back and said, "I remember you. You were the sick girl. I'm so sorry." Achieng only smiled and nodded. "I'm here now. Let's protect your child." She didn't carry anger in her heart. She carried purpose. She moved quickly but kindly, explaining each step to parents who had never trusted doctors before. She showed them how the body builds protection, how vaccines are safe, and how sickness can be stopped. She used simple words, the way she wished someone had used with her long ago. And slowly, the fear began to melt. The people saw what she had become, a woman who had come not with judgment, but with healing. That day, the village looked different. The same dusty roads, the same small houses, but something had changed. People were listening, they were learning, they were hopeful, and at the centre of it all was Achieng, standing tall in her white coat, surrounded by children who were now safe because of her. When the last child was vaccinated, the crowd clapped softly. It wasn't loud, but it was filled with respect. Achieng packed her cooler and looked around at the faces she once feared, the homes she once avoided. She didn't need their praise. Just knowing those children would sleep safely that night was enough. Some elders approached her and said, "You've done more than any of us ever could." But Achieng simply said, "I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for me." She stayed a few more days, training local health workers, setting up plans to keep the vaccines coming, and making sure the outbreak would never return. She also visited her mother's grave, laid fresh flowers, and whispered, "I did it, Mama. I kept my promise." When she finally left Nyamira again, she looked back only once, at the small clinic where she had once been told to wait outside. Now, her name was written on the door, Dr. Achieng, Immunization Program. She walked away with quiet pride, knowing her mission had only just begun. There were still many villages, many children, many mothers waiting, and Achieng would reach them all, because she was no longer the silent girl, no longer the sick child. She was a woman with a mission, and no child would be left behind. The sun was hot over Nyamira that afternoon, but the air felt cold with worry. People lined up outside the small health tent where Achieng stood in her white coat, vaccine cooler beside her. She had already spent hours that day vaccinating babies, answering questions, and comforting scared parents. Each child she helped reminded her why she had come back. She was tired, but she kept going. Her heart was full, not heavy, until she saw the man approaching from the distance. It was her stepfather, the man who once looked at her with disgust, the man who said she was too weak to survive, the man who watched her cough as a little girl and turned away like she didn't matter. Achieng froze for just a second. Old memories rushed back, sitting outside the clinic while others got vaccinated, hearing her mother whisper, "Be strong," as the fever burned inside her tiny body. But now, she was not that child anymore. She stood tall, with knowledge in her hands and strength in her voice. He walked slowly toward her, not like a man in control, but like someone carrying shame. In his arms, he held two small boys, his twin sons. They were pale and sweaty, eyes dull with sickness. He didn't speak right away. His eyes stayed low, unable to meet hers. "They're sick," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. Achieng looked at the boys. She saw herself in them, weak, coughing, ignored. She could have turned away. She could have reminded him of what he once said. But instead, she simply nodded and said, "Roll up their sleeves." No anger, no revenge, just duty. With careful hands, she prepared the vaccine. The boys looked scared, but she smiled gently. "You'll feel a small pinch," she said, like she did with every child. One by one, she gave them the shot that could save their lives. She placed bandages on their little arms and handed their father a small card for follow-up care. Then she stood up, packed her cooler, and walked away, without another word. She didn't need to say anything. The silence spoke loud enough, and the whole village had seen it. Later that evening, elders in Nyamira gathered under a tree near the center of the village. People were still talking about what had happened. The same man who once denied science had brought his children to Achieng, the girl he had once rejected, and she had helped them without hesitation. To the elders, this wasn't just kindness, it was greatness. They called her forward, their voices full of respect. One elder with a long white beard stood and said, "This village once turned its back on you, but you returned and healed us. That is not ordinary, that is destiny." He raised his hand and declared her a child of destiny. The crowd clapped, some even cried, but Achieng just smiled, soft and simple. She looked around at the people, some of whom had ignored her pain, laughed at her silence, or said she would never survive. She didn't want titles or praise. What she had done wasn't about being special, it was about being human. So she replied, in the calm voice that had become her strength, "I was just doing for others what no one did for me." The words spread across the village like wind, simple, honest, unforgettable. That night, as the stars came out, many parents held their children a little tighter. They whispered prayers not out of fear, but gratitude. They spoke Achieng's name not with pity, but pride. In homes where once science was doubted, stories began to change. They no longer said, "She was weak." They said, "She saved us." Achieng sat alone under a tree, looking at the small health tent she had set up with her team. Her white coat was folded neatly beside her. She took a small pin from her bag, shaped like a teardrop, and held it for a moment. It reminded her of the days she cried in silence, the nights she studied under candlelight, the times she felt invisible. She pinned it to her coat and smiled. She thought of her mother, whose voice had once been her only comfort. One day, her mother had said, "They'll beg you for health." That day had come, but Achieng didn't feel proud for being proven right. She felt full because she had given others what she once needed so badly: care, protection, hope. The story of the silent girl had changed. She was now the woman people trusted, the one they called in crisis, the one who chose compassion over revenge. And as she looked up at the night sky, filled with stars, she whispered the words again, not out loud, but deep in her heart. "No child will be left behind, not on my watch." Achieng could have stopped after helping her village, But she knew the sickness wasn't only in Nyamira. Across the country, there were children just like her, coughing, weak, and left behind. So she started something bigger. She founded the Silent Syringe Project, a mobile vaccine campaign with one goal: to reach children in places no one else went. With just a small team, a van, and coolers full of vaccines, she travelled from one dusty village to another. Some places had never seen a nurse, let alone a doctor. But when Achieng arrived, people lined up. They had heard her story, the girl once called weak, now saving lives. Soon, the world began to notice. Achieng was invited to speak on national TV. She sat calmly, telling her story in simple words. She didn't shout, she didn't blame, she just spoke the truth. Viewers were moved. They called her the woman who saved a generation. But Achieng didn't care for titles. Every time she gave a vaccine, she wore the same small pin, shaped like a teardrop. It reminded her of who she once was, the sick girl no one helped. Now she was the one helping, not for fame, but for every voiceless child still waiting to be seen.